There comes a moment in the life of every empath when exhaustion becomes louder than love. Not because they stopped caring, not because they became cold, but because their soul finally realized that constantly rescuing everyone was slowly destroying them. For years, the empath survives on emotional sacrifice. They become the safe place for broken people, the listener, the healer, the one who absorbs tension in silence while everyone else walks away lighter. They learn to read emotions before words are spoken. They sense pain hidden behind fake smiles. They carry the emotional weight of entire rooms without anyone noticing the cost. And at first it feels meaningful, because being needed feels like purpose. But over time, something dangerous begins to happen. The empath notices that the more available they become, the more invisible they feel. People come to them for comfort, but rarely for understanding. They are loved for what they give, not for who they are, and eventually their kindness becomes expected instead of appreciated. That is when the awakening begins. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in small moments. The ignored text after hours of emotional labor, the betrayal from someone they defended, the loneliness that appears even in crowded rooms, the terrifying realization that they have spent their entire life abandoning themselves just to avoid disappointing others. And suddenly, peace becomes more attractive than attachment. For the first time, the empath starts craving silence instead of stimulation, distance instead of drama, solitude instead of emotional chaos. They begin understanding something emotionally intelligent people discover too late. Not everyone deserves access to your energy. This is the moment the empath changes forever. Because once an empath chooses peace over people, they stop being emotionally controlled by guilt, manipulation, or approval. They stop chasing connection at the cost of self-respect. And the people who benefited from their endless emotional availability begin to panic when they realize the empath is no longer easy to drain. But this transformation is not about becoming heartless. It is about finally becoming whole. And the deeper truth is this: the empath who learns to protect their peace becomes more powerful than the empath who constantly sacrifices it. Because inner power begins the moment emotional self-betrayal ends. PT1. Most empaths do not lose themselves all at once. It happens slowly, almost invisibly. A little compromise here, a little emotional suppression there. Years of saying, "It's okay," when it was not okay. Years of prioritizing harmony over honesty. They become so skilled at managing other people's emotions that they completely forget how to listen to their own. And this pattern usually begins early in life. Many empaths grew up in emotionally unpredictable environments where peace had to be earned. They learned that love often depended on how useful, quiet, understanding, or emotionally available they could be. So they developed emotional hyper-awareness as a survival mechanism. They became experts at reading moods, tensions, and subtle emotional shifts before conflict could erupt. But the problem is this: when a child becomes responsible for everyone else's emotions, they grow into an adult who feels guilty for having needs of their own. So the empath enters adulthood believing their value comes from emotional sacrifice. They overgive, over-explain, over-forgive, and they attract people who take without ever truly seeing them. At first, the empath tells themselves this is love, but eventually exhaustion exposes the truth. Because real love does not require constant self-erasure. This is where emotional intelligence begins evolving into something deeper: awareness. The empath starts noticing patterns they once ignored. They realize certain people only appear when they need comfort. Some only respect boundaries after losing access. Others confuse the empath's kindness with weakness because they have never encountered someone who gives so much without demanding control in return. And slowly, the empath begins asking dangerous questions. Why do I feel drained after certain conversations? Why do I feel anxious around people I call friends? Why do I keep abandoning myself to keep others comfortable? These questions mark the beginning of inner transformation. Because once the empath becomes conscious of their emotional self-neglect, they can no longer unsee it. And that awareness changes everything. For the first time, peace stops feeling selfish. It starts feeling necessary. P2. The hardest part of choosing peace is accepting that some people only loved the version of you that had no boundaries. This realization breaks the empath in ways few people understand. Because empaths do not just lose relationships when they change, they lose illusions. They lose the fantasy that love alone can heal unhealthy dynamics. They lose the hope that endless patience will eventually make people treat them better. And perhaps most painfully, they lose the identity they built around being emotionally needed. For years, the empath survives through emotional usefulness. If someone was hurting, they stayed. If someone was toxic, they understood them. If someone crossed the line, they forgave them. Not because they were weak, but because they saw humanity beneath the behavior. Empaths naturally look for pain behind cruelty, insecurity behind arrogance, and trauma behind manipulation. Their emotional depth allows them to see what others miss, but this gift becomes dangerous when compassion exists without boundaries. Because understanding someone's pain does not excuse the damage they cause. And eventually, the empath reaches emotional burnout. Not from one betrayal, but from thousands of tiny emotional cuts accumulated over years of self-abandonment. That is when their nervous system begins craving something unfamiliar. Calm. Not excitement, not intensity, not emotional roller coasters disguised as passion. Just peace. And strangely, this new version of the empath begins unsettling people around them. The moment they stop over-explaining, some call them distant. The moment they stop chasing, others accuse them of changing. The moment they stop tolerating disrespect, people suddenly act wounded by boundaries the empath should have created years ago. But emotionally intelligent people eventually understand something powerful. Every boundary reveals who truly respected you and who only benefited from your lack of limits. So the empath becomes quieter, more observant, less reactive. They stop trying to save people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop fighting for connections that only survive through emotional imbalance. And for the first time in their life, they begin protecting their energy with the same intensity they once used to protect everyone else. That is not selfishness. That is self-respect, awakening. PT3. There is a silent transformation that happens when an empath stops fearing loneliness. This is the moment their inner power truly begins. Because for most of their life, the empath associates solitude with rejection. They stay emotionally attached to draining people not because the connection feels healthy, but because losing people feels terrifying. Even painful relationships can feel safer than emptiness when someone has spent years defining themselves through emotional connection. So they tolerate what destroys them. They remain available to people who only contact them during emotional crises. They keep conversations alive long after mutual respect has died. They give second chances, third chances, endless chances, hoping loyalty will eventually be reciprocated. But one day, something shifts inside them. They become tired in a deeper way, not physically, spiritually. The kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. And suddenly, Being alone no longer feels like punishment. It feels like recovery. For the first time, the empath experiences silence without guilt. They begin enjoying the absence of emotional chaos. Their nervous system slowly calms after years of overstimulation. They stop waking up anxious about who is upset with them. They stop carrying emotional responsibility for adults who refuse to heal themselves. And this peace feels almost unfamiliar at first, because empaths are conditioned to believe love must be earned through emotional labor. If they are not fixing, helping, rescuing, or absorbing pain, they wonder if they still have value. But healing teaches them something revolutionary. Their worth was never supposed to depend on suffering. That realization changes the way they move through the world. Now the empath watches more carefully. They notice who interrupts constantly, who only talks about themselves, who drains energy instead of exchanging it. Emotional intelligence sharpens because peace sharpens perception. And ironically, the less desperate the empath becomes for connection, the more powerful their presence feels. Because inner power is not loud, it is calm. It is the ability to walk away without revenge, to protect your spirit without explaining yourself endlessly, to choose distance over dysfunction, even when your heart still cares. This is why the empath becomes dangerous to emotionally manipulative people, not because they became cruel, but because they finally stopped volunteering to be emotionally consumed. PT4. One of the most painful truths an empath discovers is that not everyone wants healing. Some people only want access. Access to your patience, access to your emotional labor, access to the comfort you provide while they continue avoiding accountability. And this realization creates a deep internal conflict inside the empath, because their nature pushes them to understand people, even when those people repeatedly hurt them. They instinctively search for the wounded child inside toxic individuals. They convince themselves that if they love harder, communicate better, or stay longer, things will eventually change. But emotional intelligence eventually forces the empath to confront reality instead of potential. And reality says this: you cannot heal someone who is committed to remaining destructive. This is the stage where the empath begins emotionally detaching from chaos, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally understand the difference between compassion and self-destruction. Before this transformation, the empath often confuses emotional intensity with connection. They mistake unpredictability for passion. They believe deep love means enduring endless emotional turbulence. But after enough disappointment, their definition of love changes completely. Now peace becomes the standard. Consistency becomes attractive. Emotional safety becomes attractive. Mutual respect becomes attractive. The empath no longer feels impressed by people who create emotional confusion and call it chemistry. They begin valuing calm nervous systems over exciting personalities. They realize that mature love does not constantly leave you emotionally exhausted. And something unexpected happens when the empath reaches this level of awareness. Their silence becomes powerful. They stop arguing with people determined to misunderstand them. They stop defending boundaries that should be obvious. They stop chasing closure from emotionally unavailable individuals incapable of honesty. Instead, they quietly withdraw their energy. And this withdrawal often shocks people, because many never believed the empath would actually leave. They assumed the empath's forgiveness was infinite. They mistook patience for permanent access. But once an empath emotionally disconnects after repeated disrespect, the separation becomes almost irreversible. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Because inner power is born the moment an empath realizes protecting their peace is more important than preserving unhealthy attachments. PT5. When an empath finally chooses peace over people, their entire identity begins to change. Not externally at first, but internally. The desperate need to be understood starts fading. The constant urge to explain themselves disappears. They no longer feel emotionally responsible for fixing how others perceive them. And this shift creates a level of freedom they have never experienced before. Because emotionally exhausted empaths spend years trying to prove their intentions. They explain why they reacted, explain why they felt hurt, explain why they needed space, explain boundaries to people already committed to violating them. But healed awareness teaches the empath something life-changing. People who genuinely care will try to understand you. People who benefit from misunderstanding you will not. That realization ends countless emotional battles. Now the empath becomes more selective with their energy. They stop pouring emotional depth into shallow connections. They stop forcing reciprocity from emotionally unavailable people. They stop shrinking themselves to maintain relationships built on imbalance. And slowly, their nervous system begins trusting life again. For the first time in years, they feel emotionally safe inside their own mind. The anxiety that once followed every interaction starts fading. They no longer obsess over disappointing everyone around them. They no longer panic when someone pulls away. In fact, distance no longer feels threatening. It feels revealing. Because absence exposes truth faster than attachment ever could. The empath starts seeing who reaches out with sincerity and who only returns when they need emotional comfort. They notice who respects silence and who becomes angry after losing control over access to their energy. And through this process, the empath develops something incredibly rare: emotional self-trust. They stop ignoring their intuition just to maintain connection. They stop overriding internal discomfort for the sake of being nice. They finally understand that inner peace is not something given by other people. It is something protected through conscious emotional choices. This is where real inner power emerges. Not through dominance, not through revenge, not through becoming emotionally cold, but through emotional alignment. The empath's outer life finally begins matching the truth their soul has been whispering for years. You do not need to sacrifice your peace in order to be loved. And once that truth fully settles into their spirit, they become impossible to emotionally control again. PT6. There is a version of the empath that very few people ever get to see. Not the wounded empath, not the endlessly giving empath, not the exhausted empath desperately trying to hold everyone together, but the awakened empath, the one who has suffered enough to understand that peace is sacred. This version moves differently through the world. Their energy becomes calmer but stronger. They no longer enter rooms trying to be accepted. They no longer shapeshift emotionally to fit the expectations of others. Instead, they carry a quiet certainty within themselves that changes every interaction they have. And people feel it immediately. Because the awakened empath no longer leaks desperation. They no longer chase attention, no longer beg for honesty, no longer fight to keep one-sided relationships alive. Their emotional intelligence evolves into discernment. Now they can sense manipulation without needing proof. They recognize emotional inconsistency early. They notice when words and energy do not match. And instead of trying to rescue dysfunctional dynamics, they simply step back, silently. This silence becomes one of their greatest forms of power. Not because silence punishes others, but because it protects the empath from losing themselves inside unnecessary emotional chaos. They finally understand that every argument does not deserve their energy. Every misunderstanding does not require clarification. Every emotional invitation does not deserve acceptance. And perhaps the most beautiful transformation is this. The empath stops abandoning themselves. For years, they ignored exhaustion to keep others comfortable, ignored intuition to avoid conflict, ignored pain to maintain connection. But now, they listen to themselves with the same compassion they once reserved for everyone else. This changes everything, because when an empath begins honoring their own emotional needs, they naturally become harder to manipulate. Guilt loses its control over them. Fear of rejection loses its intensity. Even loneliness loses its power because solitude no longer feels empty. It feels peaceful. And ironically, this is often when healthier people begin entering the empath's life. Because emotionally mature individuals are drawn toward grounded energy, not self-sacrifice. They do not require the empath to destroy themselves in order to prove love. The awakened empath finally understands. The strongest soul in the room is usually the one that no longer needs to control, convince, or chase anyone at all. PT 7. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where they no longer mourn the person they used to be. They honor them. Because they understand that the overly forgiving version of themselves was not foolish. That version was simply surviving through love, the only way they knew how. They believed compassion could heal everything. They believed loyalty would eventually be returned. They believed that if they gave enough of themselves, people would finally choose them with the same depth they offered others. But life teaches the empath a painful truth. Some people are only attracted to light they have no intention of protecting. And once the empath fully accepts this, something extraordinary happens. They stop taking betrayal personally. They realize that many people operate from unresolved emptiness, emotional immaturity, or unconscious survival patterns. The empath no longer internalizes every disappointment as proof that they are unworthy. Instead, they see human behavior more clearly, without romanticizing potential or ignoring reality. This is emotional intelligence at its highest form. Not merely understanding others, but understanding yourself enough to stop tolerating what destroys your spirit. Now the empath's life becomes quieter, but far more meaningful. Their circle may become smaller, but their relationships become emotionally safer. Conversations become more genuine. Love becomes more reciprocal. And most importantly, the empath finally experiences something they spent years giving to everyone else. Rest. Real emotional rest. The kind that comes from no longer betraying your intuition, no longer forcing connections that drain your soul, no longer carrying emotional burdens that never belonged to you in the first place. And this peace changes the empath's presence completely. There is now a calmness in the way they speak, a steadiness in the way they walk away from disrespect, a silent confidence that no longer seeks validation from emotionally inconsistent people. Because inner power was never about becoming harder, it was about becoming whole. The empath finally understands that protecting their peace is not selfish, it is spiritual survival. And the people who once benefited from their lack of boundaries may call them distant, cold, or changed. But the truth is far simpler than that. The empath did not lose their ability to love. They simply stopped offering sacred energy to people who only knew how to consume it. The moment an empath chooses peace over people, their life begins to transform from the inside out. Not because they stop loving others, but because they finally begin loving themselves enough to stop accepting emotional chaos as normal. They realize that constant sacrifice is not the same as connection, that being needed is not the same as being valued, and that true emotional intelligence is not measured by how much pain you can endure for others, but by how deeply you honor your own inner truth. This journey changes the empath forever. They become calmer, more discerning, more emotionally free. And while some people will resent the new boundaries, others will finally meet the real version of them. The one no longer buried beneath guilt, exhaustion, and self-abandonment. Because peace is not weakness, it is power under control. And the empath who protects their peace becomes unstoppable, not through force, but through the quiet strength of finally choosing themselves.